Back in 2019, I was still in high school, and I just bought a brand new console, my PlayStation 4. This was the first PlayStation I'd owned since I was a kid. My very first console had been a PS2 Slim, which I foolishly sold later in life to get a new 3DS. And I grew up playing the likes of Sonic Riders Zero Gravity, Sonic Heroes, and Ratchet & Clank Up Your Arsenal. After that, I slipped mostly away to Nintendo consoles with my DS, 3DS, and Wii U, plus the Xbox 360 my parents got my brother and I for Christmas one year. But just a couple of years into the Switch era, I came to the conclusion that I needed to get my hands on a PS4. The main driving forces behind this were three games in particular. The first, Persona 5, which had caught my attention at the previous year's Game Awards, and fallen more into my realm of interest when Joker was added to Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. The second, Kingdom Hearts 3, as that was a series I'd always had a passing interest in, and now that the biggest game in that series was finally releasing, I thought it would be a good time to hop in on that. And finally, the last was Insomniac Games' take on Spider-Man, which had been heralded as one of the best superhero games ever made, and fit right into my realm of interest as over the last couple of years, I'd gotten heavily invested in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and just the superhero genre as a whole. Spider-Man had quickly become one of my favorite heroes, and in fact, getting to see Spider-Man Homecoming on premiere night had been what convinced me to watch the rest of the MCU. I had a friend whose dad was, at the time, the co-owner of a local comic book shop. They'd rented out a local theater to do an exclusive screening and trivia night for their customers, and he invited me to come along for the ride. From that point onward, I became a superhero fan and a Marvel fan, with Spider-Man as my absolute favorite hero, a love that only increased when Into the Spider-Verse released, and held its place as my favorite movie of all time until its sequel released earlier this year. And after that, I was ravenous for more Spider-Man media to consume. I checked out the original Raimi trilogy of films, and though I didn't like them at first, I'd come to appreciate them a lot more later in life. I watched the Amazing films, which I wasn't a huge fan of aside from Andrew Garfield's performance as the title character. And finally, the capstone on all of that, at least for me, was Marvel's Spider-Man on the PlayStation 4. The game blew me away on my first playthrough, and became one of my favorite games almost instantly. The combat was buttery smooth, and to avoid getting too cliche, felt exactly like playing as Spider-Man should feel. The open world offered a ton of varied activities and lots of room for customization with the different suits you could wear, which led to it being one of the most platinum games on the console. And the game's story blew me away with its expert characterizations of Peter, Mary Jane, Miles, and especially Dr. Octavius, becoming one of my favorite Spider-Man narratives to date. Just a year and a half after I played the first game, Spider-Man Miles Morales would launch on the PlayStation 5. And I was lucky enough to get my hands on that console and that game day one. Guess that's what happens when you're going to college in a tiny Wyoming town and have nothing else to do with your free time. Though a much smaller title in terms of scope and length, the game still offered some really great evolutions from the first game, especially with the new stealth abilities and Miles' Venom powers. It showed that Insomniac knew how to use the PS5 and its controller's unique aspects better than any other developer at the time, which is impressive considering this game was simultaneously developed for the PS4. And now, finally, we're here after the launch of Spider-Man 2. Developed exclusively for the PS5 this time, and releasing 3 years after Miles Morales, the game had a lot of hype riding on it. It was following up Insomniac's last game, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, which is heralded as one of the best games on the console, and once again, used almost every one of its features expertly. Not to mention the fact that the first Spider-Man game was the best-selling game on the PS4. And this game was setting its narrative expectations high with the promise of not only Kraven the Hunter, one of Spider-Man's most iconic villains, but also Insomniac's take on the Black Suit and the Venom plotline, one of the most beloved comic book stories of all time. Since its reveal trailer back in 2021, I've had this game as a high priority on my radar, and it was easily my most anticipated game of 2023. Which is insane to think about when we've also had games like Tears of the Kingdom and Mario Wonder come out last year. The first game, plus some of their other works like the Ratchet & Clank series, skyrocketed Insomniac to becoming my favorite AAA game studio, one that I actually hope to work for one day, and I've been eager to see what they would do with the sequel for years now. But now that I've 100% completed the game, there's only a few questions left to answer. Did Spider-Man 2 achieve everything Insomniac set out to do with it? Did it fix the few issues I had with the first game? Did it surprise me with innovation in its gameplay, use of the PS5's technology, and narrative? And the answer to all of those questions is a resounding yes, but. Insomniac's Spider-Man 2 is so close to being an absolutely perfect game, and in most aspects, it is an incredible step up from the first game and Miles Morales, which were both already fantastic. But there are just a few tiny little things that keep this game from being a true masterpiece. I'm going to be splitting this review into 3 core sections. Gameplay, where we'll discuss the game's core mechanic and progression systems, plus how they've evolved and changed from the first game. Content, where we'll detail the game's side quest, customization, and some other miscellaneous things. And finally, narrative, where we'll dissect the plot of the game's main story, as well as its side quest, in both a spoiler-free section and a full detail spoiler section with a warning beforehand. So, now that you've sat through all of that lengthy build-up, sorry for that, Spider-Man just means a lot to me, let's go ahead and dive into the gameplay section. Overall, Spider-Man 2's gameplay is by far its strongest aspect. The first game already excelled in making the player feel like a superhero. But this one somehow takes the best aspects of both of the first 2 games, fuses them together, and then adds a ton of entirely new stuff on top of it that almost makes it hard to go back to its predecessors. Almost, they're still great games, but... First and foremost, there's traversal, which is the first thing you'll experience when you boot up the game. While being mostly the same, with your standard swinging around and point launching, there are also a ton of additions that make traveling around New York so much more engaging and varied. The biggest one is, of course, the web wings. Activated anytime you want with a single press of the triangle button, these let you glide around the city a lot more quickly than simply swinging would, and they're incredibly fun to use, seeing how well you can swerve between buildings and how fast you can get from place to place. One of the game's trophies actually tasks you with gliding from one end of the map to the other using only the web wings, and it's an extremely fun challenge to tackle. However, you can't gain any height or momentum with these, unless you use the air tunnels and updrafts placed in set points around the city. Additionally, precision is not the web wing's strong suit, and turning quickly with them is very difficult to pull off, so it's not like this completely replaces swinging. My general traversal loop eventually became swinging and point launching to gain some height, and then once I'm above most of the buildings in the area, or I spot a wind tunnel that I want to use, I'd activate the web wings and glide over the city until I lose enough height to start swinging again. Aside from the web wings, there are a few other changes to traversal that make the experience a lot tighter than the previous games. Firstly, there are these super slingshots that allow you to go from standing on a roof to flying across New York at top speed near instantly. But I honestly didn't find myself using these much unless I had just finished an activity near one. Then there's the Venom jump and dash abilities returning from Miles Morales, allowing you to gain a quick burst of height or speed at the push of a button, with a bit of cooldown of course. Peter has also been given matching versions of these abilities, using either the symbiote or his Iron Spider arms, depending on what suit you're currently using or what part of the story you're currently in. Another ability I got a ton of use out of is the corner tether, which helps prevent you from accidentally crashing into walls when you make a sharp turn. However, one of the most impressive additions to traversal is the game's new fast travel system, which has already been praised to death by other reviewers, but I'll talk about it here anyways. Essentially, once you've completed a certain amount of a district's activities, you become able to fast travel there, and you can then select just about any street on the map to instantly load into. It's an incredibly smooth and technically impressive process that saves a ton of time, especially when you're trying to do those last few activities to get 100%. Moving on to the combat side of things, this is also a massive step up from the first game. I'd honestly say even more so than the traversal was. At first it was hard to imagine how they can improve the combat from the previous games, but with some of the features introduced here, I can't imagine how I live without them. Firstly, the most major change, which I'm sure you've all noticed right away, is the addition of these ability and gadget loadouts in the bottom left and right corners of the screen. Gadgets have been significantly overhauled, with a smaller but mostly new selection, and they feel a lot more useful than they ever did. In the first game, I rarely used the gadgets aside from the impact and electro webs, and even then I only used those to take down brute enemies a bit easier, or to handle large crowds of enemies. Here though, all of them have more general use cases, and they feel a lot more distinct. My favorite is the upshot, which, as the name implies, allows you to shoot all the enemies in an area up into the air, leaving them vulnerable for you to pull off a ton of combos. The web grabber lets you pull all the enemies and webbable objects in an area together. The concussion burst disperses and stuns enemies, and the ricochet web bounces around the environment while webbing up its targets. They all have such specific use cases that none of them feel redundant or useless, and I ended up using them all pretty frequently when I found myself in a difficult fight. And now, rather than going through a wheel to select these abilities, slowing down the pace of the fight, all you have to do is hold down R1 and press the face button corresponding to the gadget's position on the loadout. This streamlines things significantly, and makes it so much easier to pull these life-saving tools out in a pinch. Abilities work much the same way now, except you'll hold L1 instead of R1. Unlike the gadgets, however, these are character-specific, and you can only have 4 of them equipped at a time. This is kind of an evolution of both the suit powers from the first game and Miles' Venom powers. In fact, in Miles' case, all of his Venom powers are now mapped to this loadout. Rather than using your focus bar to use these abilities, like in their previous appearance, each ability now has an individual cooldown after being used, which encourages you to experiment and use different Venom abilities rather than just your 2 favorites over and over. Miles starts the game by quickly unlocking 4 of his returning Venom abilities from the previous game: his standard Venom Punch, Jump, Smash, and Dash. However, throughout the story, you'll unlock some evolved Venom abilities, indicated by this blue electricity that slot over top of specific ones, but you can switch between them whenever you'd like. These abilities are a ton of fun to use, and are also vastly different from Miles' original Venom powers, so finding the ones that work best for you and your playstyle is a treat. For example, Chain Lightning slots over Venom Punch, but instead of being a close-up attack that deals a ton of damage and knockback to the enemy, Chain Lightning is a long-range attack that can hit up to 6 enemies, stunning and dealing damage to them all, while being less powerful than a Venom Punch. All of these abilities, while filling somewhat similar roles, are very unique in their own ways, and offer completely different strategic options in combat. On Peter's side though, things are a bit different. Peter actually has 10 abilities compared to Miles' 8, for story reasons that I can't really get into here, so there are 2 abilities I won't be mentioning here. But starting out, Peter will have his Iron Spider arms as the basis for his first set of abilities, and these are honestly really fun to use. When they were introduced, I expected to be constantly frustrated with having to wait to get the symbiote abilities, even though I know it's necessary for the plot not to rush into things, but these abilities actually surprised me with how fun they are to use. We have Spider Barrage, which unleashes a quick flurry of attacks from the arms on a single enemy, great for taking down brutes and the like. Spider Rush, which propels Pete forward and brings along any enemies in his way. Spider Whiplash, which is basically Peter's equivalent to Miles' Venom Jump. And Spider Shock, which tases a few enemies in whatever direction you're facing. These can all be unlocked pretty quickly in the early game, so it's safe to say you'll be comfortable with using them until Peter gains the symbiote. Speaking of which, that is easily one of the most fun parts about the gameplay in Spider-Man 2. The way the symbiote suit is utilized in this game elevates the gameplay to an entirely new level, almost purely through its animations and abilities. We'll talk more about the visuals later, but I have to give the animators extra credit for their work on the way both Venom and the symbiote suit itself look and move. Every single animation with these packs a massive punch visually, with the way the tendrils ride and lash out with every attack, and the liquidy appearance the suit constantly has. Kudos to you all, seriously. This is some of the most impressive animation work I've ever seen done in a game. But back on the subject of how it plays, just like Miles' abilities, Peter's spider arms are replaced with a new set of abilities once he gains the symbiote suit, and these are my favorite bunch in the game by a long shot. They all pack such an incredible punch, both visually and in terms of actual usage. My personal favorite was the Symbiote Strike, which lets Peter leap into the air before coming crashing down in a massive wave, carrying all the enemies in his path with him and then flinging them away as it finishes. Symbiote Punch is pretty self-explanatory, but really fun to use. Burst has him release a massive, burst that damages all the enemies in the immediate vicinity, and Symbiote Yank grabs up to 4 enemies, which can later be upgraded to remove the limit entirely, and yanks them into the air before slamming them back down to the ground, dealing a ton of damage and opening them all up for more attacks. Additionally, each character has a super ability that can be activated by clicking both analog sticks when this meter is full. For Peter, this is the Symbiote Surge, where he enters an enhanced state, causing his symbiote abilities to recharge much more quickly, and all of Peter's standard attacks are enhanced, with every enemy you defeat getting a slick takedown animation. Miles' super ability is his returning Mega Venom Blast, a huge burst of electricity that does an incredible amount of damage to a wide area around him once. Overall, each Spider-Man's unique abilities make them stand out from one another, and each of them is worthwhile in their own ways. I personally preferred playing as Peter with his symbiote abilities, but that's not to say Miles wasn't fun to control. Far from it, I wouldn't blame anyone for liking either of them more than the other. There are a handful of new abilities that both characters have access to as well, thanks to the game's shared skill tree. See, while Miles and Peter each have their own skill tree that's tied to their exclusive abilities, there's also a general skill tree that both characters have access to. Unlock a skill there, and both of them will use it. It's kinda like how buying a weapon or unlocking a gadget in Rift Apart unlocks it for both Ratchet and Rivet. Some of the highlights of this include the Web Whip, which lets you yank a weapon right out of an enemy's hand and hit them with it, web swing combo, which lets you launch an enemy even higher into the air after hitting them with a swing kick, and wall thrash, which lets you deal a ton of extra damage to enemies you manage to corner against a wall. All of these abilities really expand the general combat loop in interesting ways, and give you a lot more options to use. Additionally, there's a new defensive mechanic introduced in this game. Whereas in the first two games your only defensive move was to dodge an enemy's attack, with closer timing granting a brief time slow effect and some increased focus gain, this game introduces parrying. Working very similarly to your dodges, a spider sense indicator will appear right above Spider-Man's head before you're about to get hit. But rather than pressing circle to dodge, you'll press L1 to parry the attack. This prevents you from taking damage while also stunning the enemy and damaging them a bit. The biggest difference though is that unlike dodging, a successful parry requires perfect timing. This makes the mechanic a lot more difficult to use and master, especially in the early game, but the developers smartly introduce a fight versus an enemy that requires parrying to damage them shortly after Peter gains the symbiote. This forces the player to get a handle of the mechanic, which honestly helped me integrate it into later fights in the game a lot more, even if I did die a few times before I got the timing right. These parry-only enemies and attacks also become a lot more common as the game goes on, with some dodge-only ones also getting thrown into the mix. Overall, this defensive mix-up really makes this game in particular a lot more difficult than the first one, but it's an absolutely welcome change. Speaking of things that make the game slightly more difficult, the focus bar has actually had some minor reworking that ends up having a major impact on how you approach combat. Just like last time, you can spend the focus bar to heal or use finishers, adding an extra layer to the combat, giving you that risk-reward factor that helps elevate the combat throughout the adventure. However, where in the previous two games you could spend partial chunks of your focus meter to heal a corresponding amount of your health, in this one you can only heal by spending a full focus bar, which limits you quite a bit more. I used to pretty much be mashing the heal button whenever I took damage in the other games, trying to keep myself at full health whenever I could, but here you have to be a lot more selective with when you heal. Do you wait until you take more damage and risk getting knocked out in that time? Or do you heal now and waste a lot of that bar you could have used for a finisher? It makes the game a lot more challenging, and is a change I really liked in the long run. One of the later suit mods you can unlock actually helps alleviate the need for those small amounts of healing, too, since you can make it so that firing webs heals you a bit, or so that every 10th combo hit does the same. Of course, making your character feel good to control in combat is only half the picture. For a game to excel in this area, you also have to introduce challenging and varied enemies for them to fight, and this is something the first game struggled with a little bit. For the most part in that game, you'd be fighting random thugs, demons, sable agents, and the like, all of them with either the same or similar archetypes that were all dealt with in mostly the same ways. You had your weapons users, shield enemies, long-range gunners, brutes, the like. Miles Morales improved on this a little bit with its underground enemies, which were a bit more varied thanks to their futuristic tech allowing for more creativity in their capabilities, but I think that this game is where they truly found a great balance with the enemy variety. Here, there are four main factions of enemies. You have generic street thugs, Kraven's Hunters and their mechanical drones, the flame cultists, and one last one I can't talk about until the spoiler section. And while some enemy types do overlap between them, they all have some that are unique and keep things fresh each battle. For example, the cultists have this flamethrower enemy that forces you to dodge some attacks and parry others, while Kraven's Hunters have some brutes that wield weapons and are easily some of the most heavy damage dealers in the game. The drones, whether beast or bird, also offer unique challenges, as the birds can interrupt your attacks in mid-air, and the beast can temporarily disable your abilities and gadgets if you don't deal with them quickly enough. There's also a hunter type that shoots this electric barrier up above you, punishing you if you rely on aerial combat too much, which forces you out of the first two games' winning strategy of get an enemy in the air and beat the shit out of them while they can't do anything. All in all, the wide variety of enemies forces you to tailor your battle strategy uniquely for each encounter, which is a welcome change since combat could get a bit samey in both of the previous games. Another area that sees significant improvement is the boss battles, which I'm very happy to report are the best in the series. Obviously, I can't show too many of them since most of that goes into story spoilers, but compared to the previous games, these ones are leagues ahead. The boss fights in the first game were fun, but most of them felt more like puzzles than actually using the combat mechanics established throughout the rest of the game. They all had to be beaten in such context-specific ways that removed a lot of the challenge aside from just avoiding their attacks. For example, the Shocker fight, one of my least favorites, forces you to throw objects at him to even be able to damage him in the first place. The standouts, like the final fights against Mr. Negative and Doc Ock, stood out because they were more open and varied in how you were able to approach them. Or at the very least, they used the whole of your arsenal rather than focusing on just one part of it. Miles Morales continued this design trend with a few of its bosses, namely the Prowler and Tinkerer fights, but also struggled with fights like Roxxon Rhino, one of my least favorite fights in the whole series, due to how repetitive and gimmicky it feels. This game, thankfully, fully lands with its boss fights, and just about every single fight feels like you can tackle it in any way you wish. Some of them do have unique mechanics and things you have to do to make the bosses vulnerable, but generally these are pretty unobtrusive and let you get back to fighting the way you want before long. Even the more spectacle-based fights like Sandman are varied enough to keep them from getting boring, and don't overstay their welcome while being challenging in their own right. One aspect I unfortunately have to say is a step back from the previous game, though, is the stealth gameplay. Or the lack thereof. In the last two games, stealth was a pretty big part of the game, allowing you to take out enemies directly via combat, with a lot more risk involved, or leap around the top of an area, luring enemies away and stealthily taking out isolated ones from above. Some encounters even required you to use stealth, like in hostage situations, for example. This was used in a few story missions, though certain side quests like Kingpin's construction sites use these mechanics pretty heavily as well. Miles Morales significantly expanded on this with its Roxxon labs and other general stealth mechanics, such as wall and ceiling takedowns, as well as Miles being able to, turn invisible. That's kind of one of his core abilities. But for whatever reason, any and all stealth gameplay is massively played down in Spider-Man 2. I know some people didn't like the stealth gameplay all that much, but honestly, for me, it provided a much better pace breaker than any of the MJ or Miles sections in the first game did. And even then, it was optional in most of the areas you could use it. Here, stealth sections have been significantly downplayed in the main story, and the closest equivalent to the construction sites or Roxxon labs are the Hunter bases, of which there are 4, unlocked by completing these smaller scale Hunter blinds in each district. And while the Hunter blinds barely even qualify as actual missions with how short their encounters can be, the Hunter bases are absolute standouts in the game for me. These massive complexes often stretch across the inside and outside of multiple buildings, with so many enemies that it would be a significant challenge to take them all out at once. So the game heavily encourages you to use stealth there. And there are even additional objectives spread throughout, allowing you to take out the comms and prevent reinforcements from being called, plus base-specific objectives, like remotely activating the turrets on the Hunter's vehicles as a distraction. All of the added stealth mechanics from Miles Morales also return here, with the addition of web lines, which allow you to fire a tightrope to attach to basically any other point you could cling to, giving you even more angles from which to take down enemies. And you can eventually get an upgrade that allows you to take down 2 enemies at once while atop these. The Hunter bases are an excellent use of the game's stealth mechanics and really showcase how Insomniac has evolved them since the first game. But unfortunately, there are so few of these bases, and the stealth sections are used so sparsely elsewhere, that it kind of feels like it went to waste. That's how rare the stealth sections are here, and I sincerely hope Insomniac brings their inclusion back up to snuff whenever the next game happens, as I think with these updated mechanics, general audiences would enjoy the stealth sections a heck of a lot more. Speaking of things people didn't like in the first game, there are a few missions where you'll take control of MJ instead of Peter or Miles, and these are thankfully a massive improvement over that game's take on this idea. In that game, many of the MJ and Miles missions were extremely lengthy, and the mechanics didn't evolve much throughout the course of the game. And though overall they could have been a nice change of pace, they just ended up significantly overstaying their welcome. Here though, they're used much more sparingly and are significantly better paced. There's actually only 3 in the entire game this time, and each of them has a distinct feel thanks to the significant changes in the mechanics of each one. The first one plays fairly similarly to the first game's last MJ mission, with her being able to take down enemies up close with her taser and distract them or lure them away. The second upgrades her stun gun into a makeshift web shooter, allowing her to take down enemies from afar, but still requiring a bit of stealth. And the third is, again, spoilers, but that one plays more like a third-person shooter, and it honestly works surprisingly well. Overall, these are far more enjoyable than the first game, and I actually look forward to replaying them when the eventual New Game Plus update drops, something I definitely couldn't say about their predecessors. And it's funny that I say I should wait till New Game Plus, because the game is so good I just kept playing it and I started a new file right away. And that about wraps it up for the gameplay section, and I'm already realizing halfway through writing this script that it's gonna be longer than the Freedom Planet 2 video, so... whew boy. Let's hope I'm actually able to get this out on time. Editor's note, I was not. But without further ado, make sure to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video, and let's get into the content section, where I talk about basically everything else other than the game's story. So there's a lot to do in this game, but it's honestly all tied together so naturally it never feels like a chore to complete. There's a ton of variety in the side quests, with all of them having some kind of fun story linked with them. Some standouts for me include the Flame side quests, which are definitely the most story-heavy of the bunch, and go into what happened with Yuri after the events of the first game's DLC, the Mysteriums, which are combat challenges for Miles relating to Quentin Beck's new immersive entertainment experiment, and these Spider-Bot collectibles, which are hidden in mostly hard-to-reach places and are all themed around different multiversal Spider-Men or other related characters. So that's super fun. There are also a bunch of one-off friendly neighborhood Spider-Man requests, which are thematically very similar to the ones in Miles Morales. They focus a lot more on the people of this version of New York, except now instead of being focused mostly around Harlem, it's all of New York. For example, there's a series of side quests centered around Miles' school, Brooklyn Visions. A really heart-wrenching one focused around Howard and his infamous pigeons from the previous games, and one where Miles has to help recover stolen instruments for a struggling local museum. Many of these are character exclusive, though some can be done by either Spider-Man. And I did notice that Miles tended to have some of the more interesting and extensive missions. My absolute favorite one of these side quests allows you to play as one of Miles' friends, Haley. She had a minor role in Miles' first game, but is brought much more into the spotlight here. See, Haley was born deaf, and thus when you play as her, all sound coming from the game is either cancelled out or significantly muffled. The most incredible part of this is that the DualSense's haptic feedback steps in to help fill the gaps for the players. Every single footstep, the strumming of instruments as you pass by them, and basically everything Haley would realistically feel is conveyed through the controller itself, and this absolutely blew me away. This is why I'll never understand why some people say stuff like haptic feedback or adaptive triggers are just a gimmick and not worthwhile. When you find a developer like Insomniac who's willing to take risks and use these features to their fullest capacity, they work to enhance games to the next level. Haley's mission would not have been nearly as enjoyable or immersive if it wasn't for all of the effort put into the haptic feedback, and I have to commend everyone on the dev team who was responsible for making this happen. They also used the haptic feedback throughout the game to enhance certain cutscenes that I'll get into later. And of course, the crackling and popping of Miles' Venom abilities is still here. Even navigating the menus packs a satisfying punch that makes it feel much more tactile than the other games. The symbiote suit also uses this extremely well, with your abilities making it feel like the tendrils are leaping straight out of the controller. Almost how throwing a punch feels in Nintendo's ARMS if you've played that. Some quick-time events and puzzles also use the game's adaptive triggers in fun and creative ways, requiring you to hold them at certain levels of tension for a short period of time. The game even uses the controller's gyroscope for a few minigames early on, though these admittedly control pretty poorly and are very gimmicky. I really wish Insomniac would embrace gyro aiming a la games like Splatoon or Breath of the Wild, as this would significantly enhance the precision offered when firing webs in this game, but honestly it would be much more impactful in future Ratchet & Clank games. What do you know, a Splatoon channel wanting more gyro aiming. The last use of the DualSense that really impressed me was, surprisingly, the controller's speaker, particularly when you use the symbiote powers, making the symbiote snarl violently, especially during the symbiote surge. You wouldn't think this has that big of an impact, but it honestly does wonders for player immersion during combat. The game's visuals are, of course, a massive step up from the first two games, and it's easily the best looking game on the PS5 so far, rivaled only by, well, Insomniac's other major PS5 title. I played the entire game in performance mode, and it maintained a rock-solid 60 FPS for the entire adventure, while still having a ton of incredible detail in its character models, environments, and particle effects. Heck, you can see some of the individual threads on the Spider-Man suits if you look closely enough in cutscenes. I did switch over to Fidelity mode briefly in the post-game just to confirm that, yep, I'd much rather have the higher frame rate, thank you very much, and immediately switched back. Though, Fidelity mode did still look great, of course. The colors are probably one of the things that surprised me the most about the visual upgrade from the first game. Miles Morales already had a little bit of this with its clashing purples and reds for the Underground and Roxxon respectively, but here, everything absolutely oozes with colorful flair, and nothing feels too muted or off. Speaking of visual flair, let's talk about this game's absolutely incredible suit variety, and the ways they've improved this system overall. Not including the bonus suits you get for buying the Digital Deluxe Edition, there are 66 suits in total, 33 for each Spider-Man. This is more suits than the first game had, but it is important to note that 29 of these suits, nearly half of them, are returning from the previous games. However, not only are all of the new suits extremely fun to use, with a lot of variety in terms of original and movie/comic designs we've yet to see, but there's an entirely new layer to customization with suit styles. After crafting a suit, you can spend more tech parts to unlock its 3 alternate suit styles, which changes up each suit's color palette, meaning each suit has a total of 4 alternate versions you can pick between when selecting it. This significantly increases the player's ability to express themselves through their suit selection, and I honestly like some of the suit's alternate colors far more than the default ones. My go-to suits for each Spider-Man are probably the default superior suit for Peter, and the teal style of the programmable matter suit for Miles. Though I do have to say, Miles definitely is the better selection of suits overall, in my opinion. Peter's can feel very samey at some points, with a lot more movie suits, with most of them having been added to the previous game via updates, but Miles' options have a lot more variety thanks to his lack of suits from the movies. Speaking of the movie suits, unfortunately none of them have alternate suit styles, which is likely a licensing restriction from Sony/Marvel and not the fault of Insomniac, but this is still incredibly disappointing. I would have loved to see alternate color schemes on the MCU's Iron Spider suit or either of Miles' main Spider-Verse suits, but alas, we will probably never get that in these games thanks to corporate meddling. Thank you, corporate rights holders, for making clearly logical decisions to protect your intellectual property from the curse of creativity. Some fans have criticized the original suit designs, or one suit in particular, which we'll get into in the spoiler section, as being over-designed, but I have to say, I don't know what these people are talking about. Yes, some of these suits are more detailed than others, and a few of them do feel a little bit too similar to one another, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. This is also something I've seen a lot of complaints about with the MCU's recent trend of giving most heroes a new suit every time they appear, sometimes even multiple suits per movie. And while, yes, this is almost definitely just a marketing scheme to sell more action figures in the movie's case, many people act like these suits are a crime against humanity just for existing. You're allowed to not like the designs, but I don't think that the same, it's over-designed argument works for all of them, especially when some of these suits are really simplistic. The game's score is also a major highlight, through and through taking the already excellent themes composed for the first two games and iterating upon them in really creative ways, plus introducing a bunch of new ones that become instantly iconic. The various swinging themes throughout this game are probably my favorites in the series, with both Peter and Miles having different variations. Peter's are more orchestral and reminiscent of the first game, while Miles are more hip-hop inspired like his solo game. They each iterate on the excellent main motif of the series in really creative ways, some more subtle than others, and it never ends up feeling like I've heard the same theme too many times while swinging around, like the first game did later on, especially during its DLC. The symbiote's theme is a corrupted, not super different, but very off version of the main motif, which really helps to highlight all of the scenes it's used in. And Kraven's main theme is an easy standout that makes his looming presence over the story feel truly massive and threatening. The voice acting also goes so far to enhance the game's story and cutscenes. Yuri Lowenthal, as usual, does a fantastic job as Peter, and his acting in some scenes as the symbiote is genuinely terrifying, especially later on in that part of the story. Najee Jitter also delivers a great performance as Miles, with his voice becoming noticeably deeper than the previous games, lending another layer to the fact that Miles is more mature and getting ready to graduate. MJ, played by Laura Bailey, has her character pushed to some deeper places throughout the game, and her performance really helps to drive these scenes home, even if there isn't a lot of the necessary build-up for her character's arc. Harry, voiced by Graham Phillips, is a standout newcomer to the franchise, replacing Scott Porter from the first game's research lab recordings, and seriously knocks it out of the park. He really sells the fact that he and Peter have been friends for years, and is incredibly endearing in the role, which makes it even more heartbreaking watching the limits he's pushed to break later in the story. Jim Peary's take on Kraven is incredibly threatening, and shows off the actor's fantastic range, making for a villain who sends chills down my spine nearly every time he appears. And of course, Tony Todd is absolutely perfect casting for Venom, and combined with the back and forth between Venom and the person he bonds with, makes for an incredibly well-acted antagonist. Of course, this isn't nearly the entire cast, but those are the ones that stood out to me the most. Some more minor characters acting I really appreciated were Erica Lindbeck as Felicia Hardy, Tara Platt as Yuri, Mark Rolston as Norman Osborn, and, of course, Darren DePaul as J. Jonah Jameson. Now, before we get into the story, time for our rapid-fire section about a bunch of miscellaneous things that I either liked, or things that could be improved in updates to this game or future games in the series. Your suits take visible damage in battle if you end up taking a lot of hits, which is a detail that makes the game feel a lot more tactile. Sometimes the other Spider-Man, or other certain characters, will appear during crimes to assist you, giving a lot of fun interactions like team takedowns and unique dialogue. You can disable some of the progression-based Digital Deluxe Edition bonuses like early suit unlocks, which I really like because it allows you to play the game as the devs intended while also having the exclusive suits. You would be surprised how many games don't let you do stuff like this. The map only reveals extra objectives in the parts of the map you've explored, which really encourages you to pace yourself as you explore rather than collecting every single one of a collectible as soon as they're introduced and marked on the map, like in the first two games. Yes, Peter's face model is still the new one introduced in Miles Morales and the remastered version of the first game, but honestly, I really feel like people give this one too much crap. It's different, sure, but I always felt like the other one made Peter look way older than he was actually supposed to be in these games. And while a lot of people accuse this one of Sony just trying to cash in by making it look kind of like Tom Holland, I couldn't disagree more. If you like the old face better, that's fine, but continuing to make a stink about it when it's 3 years since this change was made in the first place is a bit ridiculous. Pardon my bluntness, but some of y'all really need to get over this. Peter's new face is here to stay, whether you like it or not. Podcasts can't be replayed in the collections menu like they could in the last 2 games, which is a massive flaw since they can be accidentally cut off really easily. Getting the top rank in a few of the Mysterium challenges is essentially stat-locked until you unlock certain abilities or upgrades later in the game. And last but certainly not least, here we are at the story section. Let's start with some stuff I can say without getting into major spoilers. I will talk some specifics here, but only stuff that was shown in trailers or pre-release footage before the game came out. There are pretty much 2 main arcs, one for each Spider-Man, that interweave throughout the story, tied together by the actions of Kraven and his hunters. First, and of course most notably, is the mysterious return of Harry Osborn, which throws Pete's life into disarray, especially when a mysterious symbiote bonds itself to Peter and begins enhancing his very worst impulses. Around the same time, Kraven and his hunters make way for New York, attempting to use it as a hunting ground so Kraven can finally find his match. They set about capturing numerous heroes and villains throughout the city so that Kraven can hunt them, eventually leading to the escape of Martin Lee from the raft. This is where Miles' arc picks up as he sets it upon himself to track Mr. Negative down and bring him to justice, since he was responsible for the death of his father in the first game. While the symbiote plotline does get a bit more focus, both of these work really well to tell different stories about the game's main themes, which are balance in life and the importance of relying on others in times of need. However, this story isn't told perfectly. That would be a nearly impossible task. There are just a few issues that drag it down barely below the story of the first game, and a lot of it comes down to pacing. You actually hop between the 2 Spider-Men at really natural points in the story, which leads to each of their focus being fairly well balanced, but the way Peter's story specifically plays out leaves a little bit to be desired. There's some development with certain characters like MJ that we don't really see enough of it on screen for it to feel natural, and when these are supposed to be closed off and satisfying character arcs, it leaves them feeling like they came out of nowhere. Miles' arc is an absolute standout though, and has a very solid progression of his character from the previous games. The relationship between Harry and Peter is also extremely well fleshed out, and is given exactly the amount of time it needs to have the core emotional beats pay off in all the right ways. And though he stands toe-to-toe with Doc Ock and Mr. Negative from the first game, he doesn't really have the personal connections to Peter and Miles to really drive it home. Venom, however, makes up for that in spades when he's introduced, though it does feel like his introduction is a bit rushed. Kraven is still by far the better antagonist of the game overall, and in general, the game communicates its core themes very well. Those themes being that in your time of need, you should never be afraid to rely on those who care about you, and that balancing responsibilities and recognizing when you've taken on too much is the key to leading a fulfilling life, something that certain game industry executives really need to get through their heads. Unfortunately, that's about all I can say without spoiling the specifics, so if you haven't had a chance to play the game yet, I'm gonna recommend you go and do that before watching the rest of this video. I'm basically going to be going through the major bullet points of the story as a whole and giving my thoughts on each major plot beat, as well as a few smaller things, though I'll try to stay away from just recapping the plot. Spoilers start in 3, 2, 1. The tutorial we get via the opening Sandman fight is extremely well done, and I vastly prefer it to the Kingpin fight from the first game. I love that we get to see a little bit of Peter trying to find a new job after what happened with Otto, and him briefly being a teacher at Miles' school before getting fired on the first day is the exact kind of gut punch we need for the opening of the game, making you feel for the character while also establishing where Miles and Peter both are in life from the get-go. While I was a bit irritated with how long the section was, the flashback scene with Harry and Peter in high school does wonders for establishing their dynamic and just how close these 2 are as friends. The entire concept of the Emily May Foundation and the way it's used to illustrate not only the bond between these 2, but their desire to do good for the world is woven into the story extremely well. The Coney Island sequence later on also really helps show what Peter, MJ, and Harry are like at their best. And come on, you can make Spidey wear a silly little hat while you fight bad guys. What's not to love about that? I love the brief arc built up with Aaron and Miles as you go about finding his hidden Prowler stashes. Speaking from my morals, I'm very much the kind of person who believes in second chances for most people. And I think this is a beautiful story about how a person can change for the better if they're given the chance. Kraven is built up as a major threat way earlier in the game than you might expect, with him not only brutally killing Scorpion on screen, but having been revealed in one of MJ's missions to have also taken out Vulture, Electro, and Shocker. It speaks volumes to how far Kraven is willing to go to get what he wants, and immediately makes them feel far more intimidating than Mr. Negative or Doc Ock ever were. This is further enhanced by his hunt of Sandman, detailed through the Sand Crystal side quest, and the way he treats Dr. Connors later in the story, which we get to see happen on screen. The mission with Miles helping Black Cat escape Kraven's hunters is one of my absolute favorites in the game, not only because, well, you know, but because it plays into that aforementioned Second Chances story I mentioned loving so much earlier. Or, I guess in Black Cat's case, it's more like her third chance, but whatever. Dang, the whole second chance thing is coming up way more often than I realized, because now we gotta talk about the Mysterio side quest. I love the fact that so many of Spider-Man's former adversaries are shown trying to change for the better in this game. And the only reason we actually fight Mysterio is because of greedy people trying to take advantage of his name to make a quick buck. And that Mysterio fight is absolutely peak, of course. Harry's condition being kept in check by the symbiote is such a natural way to include it in the story, while also making it feel super personal to Peter. And I love how much Harry is immediately willing to help Peter fight crime as soon as he learns that he's Spider-Man. The part where Spidey and Agent Venom team up to rescue Tombstone from the Hunters is one of my favorite sequences in the entire game. And the fact that the devs went out of their way to program in a chance for Agent Venom to show up and help during overworld crimes just for this very brief section of the story goes to show how dedicated the team was to this project. Speaking of heroes that can show up and help in the overworld crimes, let's talk about Wraith, aka Yuri Watanabe. Her entire dynamic with Peter throughout the Flame side quest is so well done, their constant bickering about how to handle the situation. It feels like a very natural progression of where her story left off in the first game's DLC. The boss fight against her is where I really started to realize this game had the best boss design in the entire series, and the fact that this questline ends with a teaser for none other than Carnage is just icing on the cake. I've seen a lot of people speculate that this could be the direction the DLC for this game heads if it does end up getting DLC, and that makes total sense to me. They've already got all of the code for the symbiote enemies and stuff in this game, and I doubt they'll be bringing that back for Spider-Man 3 when that eventually enters development, but there's always the chance it could be used for a different future project. The sequence where MJ breaks into Kraven's hideout at the zoo to help rescue Dr. Connors is a fantastic evolution of her mechanics from the first game, being a lot more open and less linear, and this leads into one of the most important plot points of the game. Because Kraven straight up kills Peter here, like, he full on dies. And the entire sequence of Peter desperately trying to escape and make sure everyone gets to safety, with his heart pounding, and you being able to directly control him and feel his pulse fading in the DualSense throughout this entire section, is one of the most immersive parts of any game I've ever played. I was honestly tearing up at this section. If there's any scene that this game becomes known for, it has to be this one. The only reason Peter lives here is because this is where the symbiote transfers itself to Peter, with Harry letting it go to save his best friend's life. If I'm being honest, I haven't been directly exposed to a lot of versions of the symbiote story. Really only Raimi's Spider-Man 3 and the Venom films, and I know those are vastly inferior to most other tellings, but I would be shocked if the story of Peter getting the symbiote has ever been told better than it was here. The whole rescue Dr. Connors arc of the story was extremely well done, being paced out very well. It's lengthy, but it doesn't feel too drawn out or like it rushes through anything. After Connors is transformed into the lizard, the game gives us some nice downtime to allow the audience to really get a feel for the symbiote, not only in gameplay, but also how it's affecting Peter. And when we finally get to the point where you fight the lizard, it's hard not to be genuinely concerned for Peter and what the suit is doing to him. And also, as a minor side note, I love that Insomniac made it so the reason Dr. Connors lost his arm in this canon is directly linked to that initial discovery of the symbiote, giving Connors a personal connection to it and then making him Harry's doctor who's been monitoring how it's used to heal him adds a really interesting wrinkle to the story that you wouldn't expect. But it goes so far to add a layer of realism to it. Like, of course, he would be an expert on the symbiote, he's the one who discovered it, he lost his arm to it. And this whole sequence is almost immediately followed up by one of the most iconic parts of the symbiote story. The symbiote piloting Peter's body to fight crime while he sleeps. Showcasing this through MJ's perspective really helps illustrate how terrifying the symbiote is, and this section honestly almost plays out like a survival horror game. This is easily another highlight. After that begins my personal favorite section of the game. Miles getting captured by Kraven and his goons and being forced to fight Martin Lee really brings that conflict to a head in a very satisfying way. with a boss battle that honestly tops the Mr. Negative fight from the first game. Miles choosing to spare him and help him escape so he can let Peter know where Kraven is hiding really shows how much he's grown as a character, and sets up a very interesting dynamic between these two for the final act. Of course, Peter shows up to rescue Miles after Rio chews him out, and the symbiote conflict finally comes to a head. Peter dukes it out with Kraven in a fantastic final encounter, with him being so brutal he nearly gives Kraven exactly what he wants and kills him, until Miles steps in, leading to the single best boss fight in the game, possibly the series, fighting symbiote Peter as Miles. I knew as soon as this game was revealed to be tackling the symbiote story with both Peter and Miles that this boss fight was basically a shoo-in to happen, but I could never have expected it to be this incredibly good. This is absolutely a contender for best boss in the series, and heavily contributes to this series of missions being the best section of the game. It's something they could really have only done in this canon, as it's honestly very rare that you have Peter and Miles both operating as Spider-Man simultaneously, excluding multiverse stuff since that's an entirely different kind of story. And now that the symbiote is off Peter, I feel like I need to address how the symbiote story overall is handled, because while I love what we do get, I don't feel like we get quite enough of it. Most of the stuff we see with symbiote Peter throughout the story is focused heavily on action and how brutal it's made him, rather than how it's affecting his personality and his relationships. We get a little bit with the way he treats MJ and Miles, and there is one really well done scene where MJ and Harry both confront him about getting the suit off, as well as one earlier with Dr. Connors, but we really could have used a little bit more of this to drive home how it's changing him, as well as offer a smoother transition from Peter but a little bit more selfish to I will ignore the well-being of my friends just for more power. However, we're not done with this section quite yet, as once Peter is freed and attempts to take the symbiote to Oscorp and destroy it, things immediately go wrong, as he's confronted by Harry. This is the peak of the story between these two characters, and it forces Peter to sacrifice his best friend's health for the greater good. Of course, the symbiote won't have any of that and breaks free, bonding with Harry once more to create Venom. And this leads into one of the coolest missions in the game, playing as Venom. I had thought that Insomniac might do something like this later in the game, since Venom has always been more of an anti-hero rather than an outright villain, but suffice it to say that they blew the idea in my head out of the water. The escape from Oscorp Tower, Venom's absolutely broken abilities, brutal animations, especially with his finishers, and his incredible battle against Kraven make this a shining example of what Insomniac can do even beyond Spider-Man. A lot of people have started taking for granted how good Insomniac is at crafting action gameplay beyond just the two Spider-Men, and this goes to show the masterfully satisfying game design the studio is capable of, even with as simple as Venom's playstyle is. This has me so excited for the upcoming Wolverine game, as well as whatever else Insomniac has been cooking up, because they have mastered creating challenging and intense action gameplay that really puts you in the character's shoes. Anyway, back on the subject of Kraven, his absolutely brutal death is another perfect example of how this game excels, because Kraven wins here. He gets exactly what he wanted. The entire reason Kraven went after the villains, and eventually Peter with the symbiote, the reason he came to New York was so that he could meet his match and go down fighting, rather than let his cancer kill him. And that's exactly what happens. It wraps up Kraven's character in an extremely satisfying way, and makes him probably my favorite antagonist of the entire series so far. Like I said, most of my exposure to the Spider-Man mythos comes from the movies and these games, but this Kraven does exactly what he needs to do to elevate this story to its highest points, and is wickedly satisfying to go up against from start to finish. Speaking about the game's other main antagonist though, his grand plan does take away just a bit from his fantastic introduction. See, the symbiote convinces Harry that they can heal the world by turning everyone into symbiotes. I'm not sure if this is similar to Venom's motivations or plans in the comics, but it feels very generic to a degree, and a bit odd for the character of Venom. I understand why they did this from a gameplay perspective. It allowed them to have other symbiote enemies, and to their credit, most of these are a blast to fight, with some of the most unique behaviors and abilities in the game. However, the way Venom justifies this to Harry, or just the reasons behind it, could have been shown to us as the audience much better. It's implied that the reason Harry agrees to this is because he thinks it can eliminate humanity's flaws, with disease, hatred, and the like, but this reasoning is very lacking in the way it's communicated to the player, which holds Venom back from being truly great. I hate to admit it, but he's probably the weakest major antagonist, character-wise, out of the ones we've had in the series thus far, unless you count, like, Simon Krieger? I don't know why you would, but go off, I guess. And while we're on the topic of symbiote enemies, the Scream fight is honestly one of the best bosses in the game, and it was a genuine surprise that delighted my inner fangirl. This is what I meant when I said that Insomniac had seriously stepped up their boss design. This fight, Peter vs. the Lizard, Miles vs. Mr. Negative, Peter vs. Kraven, Miles vs. Symbiote Peter. These are honestly some of the best designed bosses I've seen in video games, period, let alone Insomniac's Spider-Man games. They've almost completely ditched the gimmicky bosses of the first two games, that focus on only one part of your moveset, and gone all in with bosses that test your full combat prowess, and I couldn't be happier. Even with optional bosses like Wraith or the more spectacle-based Mysterio, they find ways to keep the entire fight interesting without making 90% of your moveset useless. Unfortunately, the motivations behind this boss battle aren't the strongest either. Turning Mary Jane into Scream and using that as an outlet to show her inner struggles is a great idea on paper, but in execution, they just didn't do enough of showing us this build-up on screen. Like, we see that MJ is unhappy working at the Bugle now that it's under Jameson's regime again, and her struggle to keep her job is well told, but then we get to the parts in the boss where she begins venting about Peter specifically, with him always relying on her and not allowing her a life beyond that, but we aren't shown any of this. The closest we get is her repeated reluctance to move into May's house with Peter. But that's a far cry from how big of an issue this builds up MJ's struggle to be. And isn't this directly contradictory to the story of Peter and MJ's relationship in the first game? The whole thing with Peter babying MJ, pushing her away, and not allowing her to do her part in protecting New York? Naturally, he's going to come to rely on her. That's what she wanted, isn't it? I'm not saying the idea of this struggle is inherently bad, but it needed to be communicated far better. We needed to see more of Peter's over-reliance on her throughout the story, and how that was pulling her away from her own job and personal life. But if anything, we see the exact opposite. Peter pushes Miles and MJ away both to deal with his responsibilities to his career at the Emily May Foundation and Harry, his regular responsibilities as Spider-Man, and to stopping Kraven and saving New York from the Hunters. This story could have been told so well, and been a very fulfilling arc for MJ and Peter's relationship, but unfortunately it leaves MJ as one of the most half-baked characters in the game's narrative. Thankfully though, after this we're thrust back into some of the better writing for this game, with Miles and Peter going back to try and rescue some civilians from a swarm of symbiotes at City Hall. However, some of the last vestiges of the symbiote left inside Peter try to take control of him, forcing Miles to team up with Martin Lee, dive into Peter's psyche, and attempt to eliminate the symbiote at its deepest roots. And for Miles and Lee, this is an excellent way to cap off their main arc through the story. While Lee is trying to be a better person and atone for continuing the cycle of hatred he perpetuated from Norman to him and then to Miles, it doesn't excuse the atrocities he committed, and Miles doesn't forgive him, nor should he. Instead, he resolves to put the past behind them both, and as his Uncle Aaron told him at the end of their side quest, make room for the future. The way the side quests in this game link back toward the ongoing story, themes, and character arcs is honestly one of the most satisfying parts of the narrative overall, and is part of why I highly recommend you 100% it as you play, rather than waiting until the post-game to do all the optional content. But back on topic, Miles' arc, though it does get less emphasis than Peter's, is honestly stronger in a lot of ways, and it works really well to complement Peter's story, which ensures he doesn't get overshadowed. And as they venture through Peter's subconscious, the two of them find the source of Peter's rage and frustration, the death of his Aunt May, and his guilt from believing that it's his fault. This is a fantastic way to visualize the state that Peter has been in emotionally throughout the whole game, taking the emotional gut punch from the first game's finale and turning it into a major plot point of its sequel. Though, like Mary Jane's story, I do wish we had more build up to this showing Peter's grief throughout the game. We have a few hints, like Peter not wanting to clear out May's belongings at the house she passed down to him, but not enough that really establishes how Peter has felt emotionally since then. But now that Miles and Lee have helped Peter eliminate the last traces of the symbiote, he gains access to the anti-Venom suit, which absolutely tears through symbiote-type enemies, and allows him to once again use the abilities the symbiote had given him. And this decision was almost certainly made for the sake of gameplay, as permanently removing Peter's access to the symbiote abilities would have felt like a handicap for the player, whereas this allows him to keep those and expand those abilities for the rest of the game. It's not the most satisfying thing they could have done narratively, but I'm willing to forgive that for the benefit it provides the game on a gameplay front. After this, Venom steals the meteorite from Dr. Connor so he can enact his master plan, covering the entire city in these symbiote tendrils, and giving the whole thing a really menacing aura. And while Peter and Miles formulate a plan, Miles arrives with a brand new suit that got a ton of fans up in arms. I get having a visceral reaction to the evolved suit, especially since it seems like it's meant to be Miles' default look going forward in the series. But I gotta be honest, I really don't think it's as bad as people are making it out to be. Sure, it's different, but it has its own unique flair that I can appreciate. I basically said all of this in my discussion about the suit design earlier, but different doesn't equal bad. And I think this is a great way to make this version of Miles look distinct from his many other variations across all forms of media. Though, the fact that Miles just shows up in this new suit with no explanation is something I can only describe as laziness on the writer's part, though. I think it would have been more meaningful if Haley had helped Miles craft this suit, given her expertise as an artist, and the fact that Miles finally confesses how he feels about her right after this in a really sweet scene, it kind of feels like that's what they wanted to do, but for whatever reason didn't. And you're allowed to not like it, but some of you are seriously acting like the suit killed your grandma or something. But now we finally come to the game's climax, as Peter prepares to distract Venom while Miles clears out the symbiote's main nest, and Mary Jane ventures inside to take back the meteorite. The whole sequence is very well done, with Mary Jane getting a sonic blaster that lets her defeat the symbiotes directly and showing how much of a badass she is. And it culminates in an excellent final battle against Venom, beginning with Peter at Midtown High, then transitioning to Miles at the EMF, and finally ending with both of them taking to the skies above New York to deal the final blow. And thankfully, Peter and Miles, together, are able to find a way to separate Harry from the symbiote despite Dr. Connors telling them it should have been impossible. It does leave Harry comatose, leading to Norman's collapse into madness, and presumably setting up his descent into villainy when the third game eventually comes, but Harry being alive is all that matters to Peter. They could save him, even against impossible odds. He wasn't forced to suffer another loss like he was with Aunt May. He saved Harry. And the game ends on a really bittersweet note. MJ quits her job at the Bugle and starts a podcast of her own, doing her journalism on her terms. Norman goes to speak with Otto trying to find out the identity of Spider-Man so he can have his revenge. Peter decides he needs some time to be Peter rather than Spider-Man and passes the torch on to Miles, at least for the time being. And Miles and Haley have dinner with his mom's new boyfriend, and his daughter, Cindy Moon. A clear teaser for the future inclusion of Silk in the expanding Insomniac Marvel mythos. All in all, Marvel's Spider-Man 2 is a fantastic game that improves on its predecessor in nearly every way possible, pushing the PlayStation 5's hardware to its highest reaches yet, and proving that all the time, hard work, and dedication that went into making it were not wasted. But it does have a few flaws that hold it back from being the best it could be. The gameplay is unquestioningly the best in the series thus far, but the lack of focus on stealth leaves it feeling a bit repetitive, and the advancements in that part of the gameplay feel redundant. Most of the characters progress in some truly meaningful ways that make the game worthy of its sequel status, but a few lack the strong storytelling foundations they needed to make their arcs feel complete. And the narrative overall continues the fantastic story of the first game, being far better than its predecessors in the first two acts, but its final few hours leave a lot to be desired, leaving much of Venom's potential as an antagonist off the table. Regardless though, Spider-Man 2 is without a doubt my favorite game of 2023. I absolutely cannot wait to see what Insomniac cooks up in the future. And on that note, thanks for watching. I've been Kit, have a lovely rest of your day, and stay fresh.